He raised the paper so the whole room could see it, and he said her name as though he were reading a verdict. She signed it, freely, in her own hand. 40 people turned to look at Harriet Colborne, Duchess of Fenmore, and 40 people believed the paper before they believed her face. She had never held that pen. She had never sat at that desk. But the signature at the bottom of the page curved the way her signature curved, dotted the way her signature dotted, and a county that had spent 2 years waiting for a reason to stop admiring her was not going to waste the one it had just been handed. "I did not sign this," Harriet said, and her voice did not shake, which was, in its own way, a mistake, because a woman who does not weep is a woman the room decides is hiding something. The Duke only smiled and refolded the document and slid it back into his coat as though it were already settled, as though she had already lost, before a single magistrate had looked at it, before a single word of law had been spoken, and in a sense she had. Because the paper existed, and paper, in the world Harriet Colborne had been born into, was permitted to speak for a woman more loudly than the woman herself. By the end of that week, she had a trunk, a coach fare to her uncle's house in Sheffield, and nothing else. Not the house her father had built for her, not the income her father had settled on her, in writing, with a lawyer's whole life poured into the clauses. Not even, any longer, the easy certainty that the truth mattered, if enough people decided it was inconvenient. What the Duke did not know, what he could not have known, standing in his drawing room with her stolen name folded into his pocket like a trophy, was that the very document he had forged to destroy her would end up in a courtroom, in his own hands careless proof, undoing him with the precision of a debt finally called. He had not ruined her with a lie. He had handed her the one weapon in England guaranteed to outlive a duke's reputation, his own signature, badly copied, and the patience of a woman raised to notice what other people missed. Understand first what had actually been taken, because the theft was not simply of land. Augustus Colborne had built the largest steel foundry in the West Riding out of nothing but a furnace, a partnership that failed, and a second furnace bought with the money from the first man's mistakes. He was not a sentimental man, but he loved his daughter with the same unglamorous thoroughness he brought to a ledger, and when he died and left her Colborne Hall and the income that came with it, he did not simply leave it to her, he locked it. The settlement, 30 pages, drawn by a solicitor who had watched too many fortunes disappear into a husband's gambling debts, placed the estate in trust for Harriet's sole and separate use, for her whole life, beyond any husband's reach, with one single door left open, if she married, and if she chose, in writing, of her own free will, she might allow her husband to manage the estate jointly with her, not automatically, not by custom, only by her signature, given after the fact, when she was ready to give it. It was, Augustus told her the year before he died, the only inheritance worth leaving a clever woman, not the money itself, but the lock on the money, and the key that only she could turn. Everard Ashworth, 6th Duke of Fenmore, married Harriet 18 months later, and he married her the way he did most things, with an appraiser's eye and a debtor's urgency. Fenmore's roof wanted repair. Fenmore's tenant farms had not turned a profit in a decade. Fenmore's name was older than its solvency by roughly 200 years, and a duke with an old name and an empty strongbox does not, as a rule, marry for love. He had assumed the estate would simply become his. In the ordinary way, things became a husband's. He had not read the settlement closely enough to understand the lock. By the time he did, he had already married her, and the lock was already closed, and the only key was a young woman who had just begun, very reasonably, to ask her husband a question he did not want to answer. "Show me the estate accounts first," Harriet said to him, in the library at Fenmore, 6 months into the marriage, when he raised the matter of her consent for the first time. "My father kept books I could read blindfolded. Let me see yours before I sign anything that gives you my father's foundry to spend." It was not a refusal. She told him so, gently, watching his jaw work. It was the same caution her father had drilled into her over 30 years of ledgers. You do not sign what you have not read, whether the paper is a contract, or a marriage settlement, or, as it would turn out, a forgery bearing your own name. She meant to say yes eventually. She had no particular reason, in that 6th month, to distrust him. The Duke did not hear caution. He heard delay, and a man who has spent his adult life watching creditors grow patient and then suddenly not patient does not have 18 months to wait on a wife's careful reading of a ledger. He went, instead, to Mr. Josiah Pelling. Pelling managed the business of 3 great houses, and the discretion of considerably more than that, and he had learned, over 20 years, that the fastest way to keep a client was never to ask a client why. What he asked, when the Duke came to him that autumn with a request for a formal consent, properly executed, was only how quickly and how convincingly. There was in Pelling's employ a clerk named Silas Rook with a gift that had never once been put to honest use. A hand that could take 3 letters from a woman's correspondence and, within a week, produce a signature her own mother would not have questioned. Rook was given Harriet's letters to her aunt, her marginal notes in a household account book, and a fortnight to practice. He tried the signature 5 times before Pelling judged it fit to be shown to anyone, and the 5th attempt, close enough in the loop of the H, in the particular flourish Harriet gave the final E in Colborne, was the one that went on to the consent. It is worth sitting with what that means. The forgery was not a single reckless stroke of a pen in a moment of anger. It was rehearsed, refined, filed away and improved upon until it was good enough to survive a room full of witnesses who had no particular reason to doubt a Duke. The care that went into stealing her name was, in its way, more damning than the theft itself, because carelessness can be argued as a mistake, and 5 drafts cannot. The Duke did not present the consent quietly, in private, where Harriet might have contested it before it did its damage. He understood, the way certain men understand instinctively, that a lie believed by 40 people at once is a lie that cannot easily be taken back, no matter how thoroughly it is later disproved. He waited for a dinner large enough to matter, and he made his wife's ruin a piece of after-dinner theater, and he watched her deny a document she had never seen, with the calm satisfaction of a man who has already counted the room and knows which way it will lean. If that does not sit right with you yet, a man forging his wife's own name and using her disbelief itself as the final proof against her, good. Hold that feeling, because it is going to matter later, when the very same forged name becomes the instrument that takes his estate out of his hands, 1 clause at a time. Before we get there, if you enjoy watching a stolen name turn into a noose, this is the sort of story this channel exists for. Subscribe to Regency Revenge, and let's go back to the coach ride to Sheffield, because that is where the undoing actually begins. Aldous Colborne received his niece at the door of his own house with the particular grimness of a man who had spent 2 years waiting to be right about something he had hoped he was wrong about. He had never trusted the Duke, not from vanity or dislike, but from the plain arithmetic of a man courting a fortune he could not otherwise obtain. And he had built the consent clause into his brother's settlement precisely to guard against a husband who might, one day, decide patience was for other men. He had not planned for forgery. Few settlements do. A lock keeps out the man who tries the door. It does very little against the man who copies the key. Say it again, Aldous told her, once the trunk was inside, and the tea had gone cold between them. Slowly, every word he used. Harriet said it again. She had it memorized already. She suspected she would have it memorized for the rest of her life. And Aldous listened with his eyes shut, the way he listened to a foreman's account of a furnace failure, gathering facts before he allowed himself an opinion. Then we need a man who reads paper the way your father read steel, he said finally. I know one. The weeks that followed taught Harriet that ruin, once begun, does not politely stop at the drawing-room door. It follows a woman home. Sheffield was not London, and Sheffield had never much cared for dukes, but even Sheffield had heard by the second week that Augustus Colborne's daughter had signed away her father's estate and then, inconveniently, changed her mind about having done it. The milliner who had dressed her for 3 seasons sent a note regretting that her account could not, at present, be extended. An old friend from her mother's side of the family, passing her on the Sheffield High Street, discovered a sudden and absorbing interest in a shop window rather than meet her eye. It was not cruelty exactly. It was arithmetic, the same arithmetic the county in Derbyshire had performed in the drawing room, quietly recalculated by people who had no wish to be seen backing the losing side of a duke's quarrel with his wife. Aldous covered what needed covering and said nothing about the sums, which Harriet found harder to bear than if he had complained of them. She began, without quite deciding to, keeping her own accounts again, a habit her father had beaten into her before she was 12, and one that had gone half to sleep during a marriage in which she had assumed, wrongly, that such carefulness would no longer be required of her. She totted the milliner's bill and her uncle's grocer's bill and the coach fare she had not yet repaid him, in a plain hand in a plain book, because it was the one thing in the whole ruinous affair that still answered honestly to being added up. It was in that account book, more than in any conversation with Crowther, that the shape of her own transformation first became visible. Not a woman waiting to be rescued, but a woman doing, with figures, the only thing she had ever been taught to do when the world stopped making sense, taking an exact and unsentimental measure of what remained. Theophilus Crowther kept chambers 2 streets from Lincoln's Inn, and a reputation, among the small number of solicitors who specialized in exactly this kind of misery, for a patience that unsettled his opponents more than any courtroom performance could. He had lost a case once, early in his career, a merchant's widow whose brother-in-law had produced a will she swore was false, because he had gone to court with conviction and no proof, and the widow had died 2 years later, still disinherited. Crowther had not forgotten it. He had simply stopped trusting conviction and started collecting proof before he ever raised his voice. He examined the consent for the better part of an hour without speaking, and then set it beside 3 letters Harriet had written to her aunt the previous spring. "It is a good forgery," he said at last, which was not the comfort Harriet had hoped for. "The loop on the H is close. The E is close. But your pen lifts here." He tapped the paper, "before it finishes the final stroke. Every time, in every genuine sample I have, whoever wrote this pressed through to the end. It is a small thing. It will not persuade a room full of your husband's dinner guests. It might, with enough beside it, persuade a court. Enough beside it." 2 words that would occupy the next year of Harriet's life. The first difficulty was the document itself. A forged signature proves nothing sitting in a solicitor's drawer. It must be produced, examined, compared, and the Duke was under no obligation to hand over the instrument of his own fraud simply because his wife asked politely. Crowther applied to the Court of Chancery for an order of production. The Duke's counsel, a barrister named Sir Nathaniel Vance, whose fees alone told Harriet something about how much Fenmore was prepared to spend to keep what it had taken, opposed the application on every conceivable ground, and the months that followed taught Harriet more about the law's patience for a wealthy man's delay than she had ever wanted to know. When the order was finally granted, and the document finally produced, Crowther studied it for less than a minute before his expression changed in a way Harriet had not yet learned to read. "This is not the paper he held up in your drawing room," he said. It was the first turn nobody in that room had expected, least of all Harriet, who had assumed a forgery, once made, simply stayed forged. But paper ages, and ink dries at a particular, provable rate, and Crowther, who had spent a professional lifetime noticing what other men considered unimportant, pointed out that the ink on the original consent handed to the court sat too dark, too fresh, on paper, with none of the soft handling where a document shown to 40 dinner guests 8 months earlier ought to have gathered. The Duke, warned by Pelling that the handwriting would eventually be challenged, had not simply relied on his first forgery. He had commissioned a second, cleaner, more confident, prepared specifically to withstand examination, and quietly substituted it for the version that had actually ruined her. The version Rook had produced in haste, and Pelling had judged merely good enough for a drawing room, not a courtroom. It meant, Crowther explained, that they were no longer chasing one forgery. They were chasing a man who had forged something twice, and who understood, with a competence that should have frightened them more than it did, exactly what a court would look for. The second difficulty arrived within the month, in the form of two witnesses, a valet, dismissed from Fenmore's service that spring, and a lady's maid, dismissed the same week, had both, by a coincidence Crowther did not trouble to pretend he believed, found new positions in the households of the Duke's closest friends. Both now swore, under oath, that they had personally witnessed Harriet Colborne sign the consent in the Fenmore Library on a Tuesday afternoon in March. It was credible testimony. It was also, Harriet knew with a certainty that made her hands cold, entirely invented, and she understood, reading the depositions in Crowther's office, that the case she had believed was about a forged document had quietly become a case about whose word two servants would be believed over, and servants, coached and comfortable in their new positions, had every reason to hold their story steady. The Duke, meanwhile, was not waiting for a verdict to begin protecting himself. Tenant farms that belonged to the Colborne Trust began appearing, discreetly, in the hands of Fenmore's associates. Foundry shares changed ownership. Every month, the case dragged through Chancery was a month the Duke used to move what he had stolen further out of reach, so that even a victory, should it ever come, might arrive to find nothing left to recover. Harriet sat in her uncle's parlor one evening that winter, with the ledgers spread across the table the way her father used to spread them, and admitted to herself, for the first time since the drawing room, that she might actually lose, not because she was wrong, but because being right had never, in her experience, been sufficient on its own. The turn, when it came from a drawer nobody had thought to search, though it began, in fact, with a knock at Aldous' door that nobody had thought to expect. The woman on the step was Nell Hartley, who had been Harriet's own lady's maid for 3 years before the marriage, and had stayed on at Fenmore afterward, at Harriet's particular request, and who had been dismissed the same week as the valet, though for a different reason entirely. She had refused, when asked, to add her name to the story the valet and the other maid were being coached to tell. She had said only that she did not remember any Tuesday in March because she had not been in the library, and no amount of suggestion from the housekeeper had persuaded her to remember one. "They let me go quiet, ma'am," Nell said, standing in Aldous' hallway with her hands folded tight around her own thin traveling case, "on account of I wasn't useful to them any longer. But I kept my ears, before I went. Mr. Pelling's clerk drinks at the Feathers of an evening, and he talks when he's had enough of it. He said there'd been drafts, practice papers, said Mr. Pelling ought to have burnt them and never did, on account of he never burns anything, keeps every scrap in that office like it might be wanted again someday. It was not proof. It was a rumor, overheard in a public house by a dismissed servant, with every reason to want the Duke embarrassed. But Aldous, who had built a foundry on the principle that even an unpromising piece of ore was worth assaying before it was discarded, thanked her, found her a position in his own household rather than let her go without work for her honesty, and set about finding a way into Pelling's files that owed nothing to guesswork and everything to patience. Aldous had spent the better part of 2 months doing what he did best, tracing money and paper the way his brother had traced flaws in a cooling ingot, patiently, methodically, assuming nothing was as clean as it looked. He had a contact, a former clerk of Pelling's own office, dismissed for drunkenness rather than dishonesty, who still knew where certain files were kept and bore Pelling no particular loyalty. Among Pelling's routine correspondence, filed, as careless men file the things they never expect anyone to ask for, was a single folded sheet, Silas Rook's practice draft. Harriet's signature, attempted 5 times down the margin, each attempt slightly more confident than the last, in a hand that was unmistakably not her own, on paper bearing Pelling's own filing mark in the corner. It did not merely suggest a forgery, It documented one, commissioned, practiced, refined, in the Duke's own man of business's own office, and Crowther, holding it up to the window to read the watermark, allowed himself, for the first time in the whole affair, something close to a smile. "This," he said, "is the nearest thing to a confession Chancery is ever likely to see." But a solution, in this story as in most, arrives with its own complication attached. The Duke, learning through Pelling, who had begun, in the manner of frightened men doing careful arithmetic, to calculate which side of this affair was safer to stand on, that a practice draft had surfaced, did not panic. He counterattacked. His counsel argued that the draft was not evidence of a forgery at all, but a forgery of a different kind, planted, they suggested, by Harriet's own uncle, manufactured to fabricate proof of a fraud that had never occurred. A document found in an opponent's reach, Vance argued smoothly to the master in Chancery, proves nothing except that opponents know how to plant documents. It was, Harriet had to admit, a clever answer, and cleverness was exactly what frightened her about her husband, not his cruelty, which she had already priced into her expectations of him, but the fact that he was rarely, in any of this, careless twice in the same way. And then he produced his best answer yet. The valet and the lady's maid returned to the stand, their story sharpened with new, precise detail. The particular quill Harriet had supposedly used, kept in the library's third drawer, the particular gray overcast of that Tuesday in March, the particular chair she had supposedly sat in to sign. Detail, the Duke understood, was what made a lie survive. Servants who could describe the weather were servants who had, surely, actually been there. Harriet read the new depositions in Crowther's office and felt something close to despair, not because she doubted her own memory, but because she understood, watching Crowther's carefully neutral face, that a court might reasonably believe two consistent servants over one forged practice draft that opposing counsel had just called a fabrication. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person when she stops waiting to be rescued. It settled over Harriet that week, in her uncle's parlor, not as despair exactly, but as something colder and more useful. The recognition that no one was coming to save her, that Crowther's cleverness and Aldous' patience had brought her exactly to the edge of a case she might still lose, and that whatever happened next would have to come from her. She thought of her father, not sentimentally, but practically, the way he had taught her to test a length of steel not by looking at it, but by loading it, watching where it actually gave. She asked Crowther for the two servants' depositions again, and this time, she did not read them for the story they told. She read them for the date. The consent itself, the one both servants swore to having witnessed, was dated the 14th of March. Harriet had not been at Fenmore on the 14th of March. She had been 200 miles north, on the foundry floor in Sheffield, standing beside the foreman during the annual spring inventory. A journey she made every year of her married life, without exception, because her father's foundry did not stop its books for anyone's marriage. The inventory ledger for that week, kept, as it always was, in the foundry's own hand and cross-checked against Harriet's own tallies, initialed by her in the margin, placed her on that floor, counting finished stock, on the 14th and 15th of March. She had not been in the library. She had not held the quill in the third drawer. She had been 200 miles away, initialing a column of numbers. On the exact day, two well-coached servants swore under oath they had watched her sign her own ruin. Crowther read the ledger entry 3 times before he spoke. An alibi, he said slowly, is a very difficult thing to perjure around, once it exists in someone else's handwriting, kept for reasons that have nothing to do with this case. The servant's testimony did not merely weaken. It collapsed, and it took the Duke's counterattack with it, because a jury, or a master in Chancery, which amounted to the same careful, unforgiving audience, does not easily forgive a witness caught inventing weather, for a day the accused was demonstrably elsewhere. Faced with the ledger, the valet's composure did not survive a second round of questioning. Within the week, both servants had recanted, admitting, in exchange for an assurance that they themselves would not be prosecuted, that they had been instructed, coached, in the valet's own uncomfortable word, by a friend of the Duke's, on what to say and how to say it. And Pelling, watching the ground shift beneath the case he had built, chose the moment every frightened man eventually chooses, and went to Crowther himself. What he brought was worse for the Duke than anything Harriet had imagined, because it did not simply confirm the forgery. It answered a question she had never quite let herself ask. Among Pelling's earliest correspondence with the Duke, 18 months before the drawing room, 4 months before the wedding itself, was a letter in the Duke's own hand, asking Pelling to review, discreetly, the precise terms of the Colborne settlement. Particularly, the Duke had written, any clause touching a wife's consent, and how such a clause might, in time, be managed. Pelling had written back with a summary of the trust's lock, and a delicate suggestion that management, in cases of a reluctant wife, sometimes required assistance beyond persuasion. The Duke had not discovered the consent clause after the wedding, in a moment of frustrated impatience, as Harriet had always assumed. He had known about it before he ever proposed. He had married her with the forgery already, in some unformed way, priced into his plans, not as a last resort when persuasion failed, but as the intended mechanism from the start, should persuasion prove inconvenient. The courtship, the year of careful attention, the small kindnesses Harriet had once mistaken for the beginnings of real affection, all of it had been conducted by a man who had already asked his solicitor, before the wedding, how a wife's lock might eventually be picked. Harriet sat with that letter for a long time before she said anything at all. I hesitated, she said finally. To Crowther, to her uncle, to no one in particular. I told him I wanted to see the accounts first. I have spent a year believing that hesitation was what provoked him. It was not. He had already decided, before he ever courted me, that my consent was a formality he would obtain, one way or the other. It did not make the forgery worse, in the narrow legal sense, but it made the man who had committed it a great deal clearer, and Crowther, watching her fold the letter closed with hands that had gone very steady, understood that whatever mercy Harriet might once have been inclined toward had just quietly finished leaving the room. The Dowager Duchess came to Colborne without sending word ahead, which was, Harriet would later reflect, the only apology the older woman knew how to make. She was received in the small parlor rather than the good one, and she did not seem to notice the slight, or perhaps chose not to. She had aged since the wedding, more than 2 years should account for, and she came to the point with none of the practiced ease Harriet remembered from a dozen careful dinners. Fenmore has not paid its debts honestly in a generation, the Dowager said. I told him, before ever he proposed to you, that a marriage to a fortune with a lock on it was worse than no marriage at all, unless the lock could be persuaded open. I did not tell him to forge anything. I want that understood. But I told him the lock had to open, one way or another, and I did not ask him closely enough what he meant by another, because I did not want to know the answer. She looked, for a moment, considerably older than her years. I have not slept well since the drawing room. I am not asking you to forgive him. I am not entirely sure I have forgiven myself. Harriet did not offer the comfort the Dowager had perhaps hoped for, and did not withhold it out of cruelty either, only out of the same plain honesty that had cost her so much already. You did not forge my name, she said. He did that without needing your help, but you might have asked him, once, what he meant by another, and you chose the comfort of not knowing instead. I understand the choice. I do not think it costs you nothing. It was not forgiveness. It was, Crowther observed afterward, something more useful to the case than forgiveness would have been. The Dowager's own written statement, given freely, confirming that the question of managing the settlement had been discussed in the family before the wedding ever took place, and that she, at least, had never authorized, and had specifically warned against, anything beyond persuasion. It corroborated Pelling's letter without a single word of pressure from Harriet's side, and it meant that when the Duke's counsel next tried to suggest the whole affair was a conspiracy of servants and solicitors, There would be his own mother's sworn statement sitting in the record, agreeing that the scheme had been discussed, in this family, long before any clerk had ever practiced a signature. We are close now to the room where all of this gets read back to him. The forged name, the second forgery made to survive a court, the practice draft filed in his own solicitor's careless hand, the coached servants undone by a foundry's honest ledger, the letter proving he had planned the theft before he had ever proposed marriage. If watching a stolen signature become the rope that hangs the man who stole it is the kind of story you come back for, this channel is built entirely around that reversal. Subscribe to Regency Revenge, and let's finish it. Crowther laid the case before the master in Chancery that spring, with the same unhurried thoroughness that had cost him, and won him, so much over the years. He did not lead with outrage. He led with the practice draft, the ink analysis proving a second forgery had replaced the first, the foundry ledger placing Harriet 200 miles from a library she was sworn to have signed in, and Pelling's own signed affidavit, given, at last, without conditions, describing the Duke's instruction to forge the consent from the very beginning of their acquaintance with the settlement. The Duke's counsel tried what remained to be tried. He suggested a conspiracy of uncle and solicitor and disgruntled clerk, all somehow aligned against an honest man. It did not survive contact with 5 documented attempts at a woman's signature, filed under a real man's real filing mark, in a real drawer, in a real office that belonged, however many steps removed, to the Duke himself. The decree, when it came, said plainly what the paper had said all along. The consent was a forgery. The Duke had commissioned it. The seizure of Colborne Hall and its income had proceeded from a fraud upon the court and upon his wife. And the original trust, Augustus Colborne's lock, drawn 30 pages deep specifically to survive a husband like this one, stood, exactly as written. The estate was to be restored to Harriet's trustees. The lands quietly sold off during the case were to be recovered, and the costs of the fraud and of its unwinding were charged against Fenmore itself, at the court's discretion, to make the injured party as whole as paper could make her. The Duke read the decree once, standing in the antechamber, and then read it again, as though a second reading might produce a different verdict. Harriet found him there, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned, over the length of this ordeal, that the quietest sentence in a room is often the one nobody in it can argue with. "You forged my name," she said, and held it up before 40 people, and let them decide I was a liar for saying I hadn't written it. You spent months making certain the forgery could survive a court, and coached 2 people to swear to a day I was 200 miles away. And in the end, the thing that undid you was never anything I invented. It was your own hand, badly copying mine, 5 times, in a drawer you thought no one would ever open. I did not need a weapon, Everard. I needed only the truth, and enough patience to let your lie finish itself. He reached, once, for the version of himself that had always served him before, the wounded dignity, the suggestion that a vindictive uncle and an ambitious solicitor had manufactured a case against an honest man who had only ever wanted what was, in some sense, already his. It did not survive the practice draft. It did not survive the ledger. It did not survive Pelling's affidavit, or the letter written 18 months before the wedding, in the Duke's own hand, asking how a lock might eventually be picked. Few defenses survive a lie being read back to the man who told it, in his own handwriting, by the person he told it about. "I did not come here for an apology," Harriet said, before he could offer one he did not mean. "I came because it was time you understood exactly what you had actually forged." She was, in the end, more merciful than the county expected, and considerably more merciful than the Duke had any right to hope for. She did not press for his public disgrace beyond what the decree itself already guaranteed. She wanted the consent voided, the estate restored, the sold lands recovered, and the costs charged, and no further ruin beyond that, because she had spent a year watching what it cost innocent people when a great house's reputation collapsed, and she was not willing to let the tenants, or the foundry workers, or the household staff who had served faithfully through all of it, pay for a crime that was entirely her husband's. What she permitted herself, quietly, was the knowledge that the county, which had once looked at a forged signature and believed it over her own sworn word, would now spend the rest of the Duke's life knowing precisely what kind of man he was. Not because she had told them, but because the decree, and the case behind it, was a matter of public record that no dinner party smile would ever fully outrun. Harriet returned to Colborne Hall on a bright morning that autumn, with her uncle beside her and the ledgers under her arm, and the tenants noticed only that the woman walking the fields with her father's own steady, unhurried attention to the land was, at last, the one actually entitled to walk it. The rents grew fairer within the year. The books were kept, once again, by someone who read every column before she signed anything beneath it. A habit, she told her uncle once, that she intended never to break again, for any reason, for any man. She kept the original forged consent, in the end. Not the clean second version the Duke had prepared for the court, but the first one, Rook's hurried, imperfect copy, the one that had actually stood in that drawing room and ruined her. She kept it in a drawer in the estate office at Colborne Hall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the particular lesson the whole affair had taught her, that the most dangerous weapon a woman can be handed is not one she forges herself, but one her enemy forges against her, badly enough, and keeps, carelessly enough, that it can eventually be turned around and read back to him in a room he cannot leave. What she did not say aloud, that final week in Crowther's office, was that Pelling's abandoned files had held more than one such draft. Other names, other practice signatures, other consents, drawn up for other great houses, for other wives who had said, in other drawing rooms, that they had never signed what was being held up in front of them, and had not, any of them, been believed. Pelling did not stand trial alongside the Duke. His affidavit, given in time and given fully, purchased him that much, though it did not purchase him his clients, who abandoned him within the season, nor his reputation, which never recovered enough for him to open another office under his own name. Silas Rook, the clerk whose practiced hand had done the actual forging, left London entirely and was not, so far as Harriet ever learned, heard from again. The valet and the lady's maid who had perjured themselves were not prosecuted, as promised, though neither found service again in any house that troubled to ask for a character reference. Nell Hartley stayed at Colborne Hall the rest of her working life, and was, by the time she was too old for service, drawing a pension Harriet insisted upon over the objections of no one, since it was, by then, entirely Harriet's own money to insist with. The Duke of Fenmore kept his title, because titles are not so easily undone as estates, and he kept enough of Fenmore's own lands to avoid outright ruin, because Harriet had asked for restoration and costs, and nothing crueler. But he did not marry again, and he was not, for the remainder of his life, received in quite the same rooms, with quite the same ease, because a decree of chancery is a public document, and a county that had once found it easier to believe a piece of paper than a woman's word found, in the end, that the paper had told the truth about him after all, simply not the truth he had intended it to tell. Harriet ran Colborne Hall and her father's foundry for the next 4 decades, and she read every account that crossed her desk before she signed anything beneath it, and she never again mistook a man's patient courtship for evidence of his character. She kept the original forged consent in the estate office drawer until the day she died, not out of bitterness, but because she had learned, at considerable cost, that the surest way to disarm a lie is to keep it where you can see it, filed, examined, and entirely, finally, in your own possession. The Duke of Fenmore had been the first of Pelling's clients to have his own forged lie handed back to him in a court of law. He would not, Crowther was already quietly certain, be the last. And if this channel is still here when the next one comes to light, Regency revenge will be the one to tell it.